Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from WCA Biology B, and we are looking at Unit 7, Lesson 7, Evolution of the Influenza Virus. So our keywords here are genetic drift, influenza, mutate, antigenic drift, and interferon. And just as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, below my video link in my website, you're going to find a link to a study guide where I go through some key ideas as well as have some questions that I ask that are really going to keep you focused and make sure you're really understanding the main ideas for this lesson. So the lesson begins kind of talking a bit about the difference between genetic drift and natural selection, just as a reminder, because both of them can lead to evolution. Evolution is just change in the allele frequencies in populations. So remember our phenotypic changes in populations. So remember that organisms have specific phenotypes, like hair color or eye color. And for each phenotype, there are different alleles, like green eyes or blue eyes or brown eyes, right? Those are our alleles. We see variation in a population naturally occurring. And if over time the variation becomes, it changes. So, for example, if brown eyes are the most common trait, and over many generations, we start seeing blue eyes become the most common trait, then we're seeing what's known as evolution, a change in the frequency of a specific trait over time. How that evolution happens depends. One way in which it happens is through genetic drift, and this is kind of a random thing. So, genetic drift has nothing to do with the actual phenotype, the actual trait. It's just kind of random and accidental in a way. So the example that is given is if there's a tree and in that tree there lives beetles and there are brown beetles and there are red beetles. In fact, actually there's a little bit of a typo here, guys, because it says there are 4 green beetles and 2 red beetles. And then during a thunderstorm, the wind blows away the red beetles, leaving only the brown ones behind. When in fact it should say leaving only the green ones behind. But regardless, the concept is sound there. It's very much correct. So if that happens, a thunderstorm comes into the area and blows the red ones away, leaving just the brown ones behind. There's going to be a change in the coloration of beetles. There's no more red beetles. So over the next generation and subsequent generations, there won't be any more red beetles. Is it because red represented a color that was a disadvantage? No, there is nothing wrong with being a red beetle. The winds just so happen to pick those beetles up and carry them away. So that's random chance. That is kind of a good example of genetic drift, a kind of a good understandable example. Natural selection has to do with the traits themselves. Are the traits providing an advantage? Are they helping the organism to survive, or are they hurting the organism and making it harder for them to survive? Because this is evolution based on the traits themselves, that is why they fall into the category of natural selection. So there has to be 4 different things that are happening. First of all, there has to be reproduction. You have to be having offspring in order for evolution to take place from natural selection. You need to have variation. There has to be differences in the population because some variation is going to be an advantage and some won't. So in order to have that situation, you need to have at least two different traits, right? And then those that are born have the ability to compete for the limited supply of resources. If that trait gives them a better advantage to be able to compete, get resources, survive, reproduce, they can pass on that genetic information to their offspring, number 4, and that trait will be more likely to be observed in the next generation and generations going forward. If the trait provides them with a disadvantage, then we see that trait disappear over time because organisms that are born with that trait will not be able to survive to reproduce, or they will have a less likely opportunity to do so. And we'll see that trait, the numbers of that trait get lower and lower, and it will eventually disappear in generations to come. So it says natural selection leads to a population dominated by organisms that are anatomically, behaviorally, and physiologically well suited to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. So that's why we see adaptations that are so well suited for specific environments, because through this lengthy process of some survive, some don't, and a slight change in allele frequency over many, many generations, we see that only those that have survived really can fit and really can compete. Now, we see the same kind of characteristics in populations of very, very small things. Viruses, which aren't technically living things, but they still can reproduce, and bacteria, which are living things. And we like to look at them because they do mutate. And so we see that variation. There is that competition and that reproduction that takes place. There's still genetic information that's passed on from parent to offspring, but the life cycles are so small and very short, right? And they can reproduce a lot and produce a lot of offspring. So we're able to keep track of many, many, many generations in just a very short period of time. Therefore, we see the changes happening much more rapidly than they are in, say, animal populations and stuff like that. As it says here, influenza is a viral infection that affects the respiratory system in humans. It mutates just like other viruses does. We're all probably familiar with some of the mutations we've even seen with the coronavirus or the COVID-19 virus, right? The different variants, the Delta variant and the Omicron and stuff like that. So these are slight genetic changes to the influenza virus, but it's still the influenza virus. It has not changed enough to make it a different virus. It's still the influenza virus, it's just a little bit different. So how this works is that your body has the ability to recognize a virus once you've had that infection before. And one of the things that it does is it recognizes proteins that the virus displays on the outside of the virus. So here's an example of your influenza virus, and it talks about two specific proteins, HA and NA, that are displayed. And your body's immune system will recognize those proteins, and if you've had the infection before, your immune system will kind of send out a little bit of an alarm bell once it recognizes that you are now infected again with an influenza virus, and it will be able to get your immune system working and fighting the infection before you get too many of the viruses in your body. And ultimately, you might not even know you ever got sick because your immune system did its job. What happens with mutations is if those proteins are modified even a little bit, your body's immune system may not recognize it anymore. It might be escape the immune system's detection, and it will continue to make copies of itself. It replicates itself using your body's um, cell mechanisms to do so, and it can make more and more copies of itself. I think it's actually, there's a couple, another slide later that kind of shows that process. And your body will not recognize that you're infected until you have millions and millions of copies of that new virus in your body. So that's how it works as an advantage to the influenza virus. It allows the influenza virus to escape detection, if you will. So the influenza virus mutates more than any other virus that we know. It has a very high mutation rate. And this is why flu vaccines, you have to be vaccinated every year, because the virus mutates. And the vaccine that worked the previous year might not be effective anymore because it's no longer effective to the current mutation of that virus, right? It's also why sometimes the flu vaccine isn't really that effective at all, because it takes time and money for um, the vaccines to be produced. And remember that there's different seasons in different parts of the world as well, right? So right now it is summer going into fall in the southern hemisphere. And so they're going to be heading into flu season very soon. And so what we can see is we can see what flu is predominant in different parts of the world when we're having summertime. And then they'll manufacture a bunch of different vaccines that are of that type, right? So then when winter comes around here, we hope that that is still the strain of the flu that is going to spread in the United States. But it may have mutated some. And by the time it gets here, it might not exactly match what the vaccine is made for, if that makes sense. So sometimes it's a really good match, and sometimes the vaccine's super effective, and some years it's not so good. And so the vaccine isn't as effective as we'd like it to be. So that's why that the flu vaccine isn't always 100% effective, and why it's recommended that you get vaccinated every single year. Another example of natural selection in small things, right, is in the, let's see here, you know how some people are lactose intolerant. Me, I am lactose intolerant. So for some people, there's an enzyme that your body can manufacture that helps with the digestion of a sugar that is found in milk called lactose. Now, most people are born with this enzyme, the ability to make this enzyme, because when you're babies, you drink milk. It's part of being a mammal, and you have to be able to digest milk. But into early childhood, most mammals lose the ability to produce lact the lactase, the enzyme to digest lactose, because in general, adults and older children don't drink milk in mammals, right? Humans, we do this just because we can. So what we found is that some people over time have developed the ability to continue to produce that lactase, that enzyme to help digest milk. And it is more likely to be found in people whose ancestors once lived in Europe, Turkey, and central parts of Africa, because this is where we had a lot of people that raised cattle and goats for food, and they also drank a lot of milk from the cattle and the goats, right? Because they have this ability to get nutrition from the milk, it provided those people with an advantage. And so those that could have that um, digestive enzyme in their bodies they were more well nourished. If you're more well nourished, you're probably not going to be susceptible to diseases. You probably have a better chance of living. And so over time, we see that people of this, who are descendants of those that kind of raised these cattle and goats and stuff in ancient times, have more likely to have that enzyme present into adulthood. And actually, only about, it says here, about 40% of humans have this ability, which is interesting. Yet another example of natural selection in small things is antibiotic resistance. We see this in bacteria. So antibiotics are wonderful. Antibiotics, when they came into existence, when we discovered them, they really helped treat common things like strep throat, made it something that no longer became deadly over time, right? So they're amazing things, and it was an amazing um, discovery that led to people not dying of common infections. However, problem is that bacteria, um, naturally, some bacteria will not die when you take an antibiotic. Most will die, some will survive. They have some natural immunity to it, right? Just a few of them. And if you're sick and you've got a bacterial infection and 98% of your bacteria die, you're probably going to have your immune system can recover and you'll be able to get better from that infection. But over time, the number of resistant bacteria can increase. And eventually, those resistant bacteria become the dominant type of bacteria. And so the antibiotics that worked in the past to kill off infections no longer work the same way or at all for the same types of infections today. And the problem is that we only have a certain number of antibiotics. We're kind of, running out of them. So there are certain diseases out there that are resistant to even, well, are resistant to everything except maybe the strongest of all of the antibiotics that we have. And that's kind of scary because if we find a really highly infectious bacteria that is resistant to all known antibiotics, then that would be something we would not be able to treat, right? So that's why antibiotic resistance is kind of frightening, but it's also an example of natural selection. The bacteria that survived had natural resistance. they survived, reproduced, and that natural resistance was carried on to the next generation. And that it was done over many, many years, so that today, 100 years or so after the development of antibiotics, we're seeing some very, very resistant bacteria strains that we do not have antibiotics for. These aren't new bacteria strains. They've always existed, but they've become more dominant. And in some cases, I take it back, there's probably some new ones through mutations as well, right? Um, but that's kind of why antibiotic resistance is a good example of natural selection. And then finally, the final thing that's discussed in this lesson is, let's see here, I'm going to get to this part, make sure we have everything covered. Okay, antigenic drift, and I'm going to get to that part here. It's in the latter part of the lesson. We get onto this. We kind of talked a little bit about this as well. This is again where you've got the influenza, which displays these two different proteins. They're called antigens. That's what that is. And as they mutate and change, they are slightly different from one generation to the next. And over time, they become different enough that your immune system can't recognize them. That's called antigenic drift because the antigens are what's changing, right? What it does say here is that sometimes it backfires for the virus because in order for your body to be able to replicate the virus and make copies of it, it can't be too different. If it becomes too different, too mutated, your body can no longer recognize it well enough. It's no longer able to successfully replicate in your body. So that's an important thing as well, that the virus needs to be able to mutate to escape the immune system. But if it has mutated too much, the mechanics of your body's cells does not work properly to be able to transcribe that viral DNA into messenger RNA and to be able to actually make new viruses from that. It won't work anymore. So it's kind of a fine line, at least for the virus to be successful. All right, guys, that's everything from Unit 7, Lesson 7, the evolution of the influenza virus. I will see you guys in the next lesson.